recording. Okay, so back to Jennifer Mattei. After starting her career as a professor at Sacred Heart University, she continued her team efforts at the Fresh Kills landfill with a 5-year National Science Foundation grant to study plant-animal interactions at the site. In 1999, she began her work on the population ecology and conservation of Long Island Sound horseshoe crab, named Project Limulus. And recently, she co-authored 2 book chapters in Changing Global Perspectives on Biology, Conservation, and Management of Horseshoe Crabs, 2015 Springer, New York. Through this work, it became clear that overharvest, loss of habitat, and climate change were leading factors in the decline of horseshoe crabs worldwide. Mattei is a member of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Species Survival Commission Horseshoe Crab Specialist Group. Mattei, in collaboration with colleagues at Sacred Heart University, began working on the installation of a living shoreline to dissipate wave energy, slow shoreline erosion, and allow for sediment deposition. Mattei's research is currently being supported by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation, and DuPont Corporation, the project titled Stratford Point Living Shoreline, Restoring Coastal Habitats to Maintain Resiliency and Function, and includes installing an artificial reef, salt marsh, upland dune mosaic, several acres of pollinator meadow, and upland coastal forest habitat. So with this background, she has so much to offer. I'm incredibly excited and happy to have you join us for this second discussion of the Southeastern Massachusetts Pine Barrens Alliance, our group. We've become horseshoe advocates and are initiating a series of talks and information about horseshoe crabs in Massachusetts. So thank you, Jennifer. Really appreciate your being here.
Sure. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I hope it didn't put everyone to sleep here. So can everyone see my screen? That's the first step. All right, good. And everyone can hear me. All right, good.
Looks really good.
Okay. So just to sort of introduce the topic, I shortened my title quite a bit. So we're going to talk about horseshoe crabs and sort of why should everyone care about them. But beyond that, we'll talk a little bit about the habitats they need to survive and that type of conservation. Also, I want to draw your attention, if you wanted to, your group could sponsor a event on International Horseshoe Crab Day, which we're in our 3rd year now, and it's always going to be on June 20th, however that falls. And so this year, we also have a Facebook page that we're working on to display worldwide anyone who's doing any type of horseshoe crab conservation work. And our first year, we actually had small film clips from people from all over Southeast Asia and along the east coast of the US where horseshoe crabs are found. So there's a lot to learn about. And just want to quickly, again, call out to the sponsors of my work, particularly U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who supply the tags that we use, and these other granting agencies that have been of great support. And I want to step back a minute and just talk about sort of the estuaries that are very important for horseshoe crab survival, along with many other species. And the United Nations has recently released a report that average abundance of plant and animal life has fallen by more than 20% worldwide. So we have a huge human footprint on the earth right now. And so that's directly through development, et cetera, everything we do to change habitats into other things. and indirectly, of course, climate change. And so species that were once dominant in our different and varying habitats are in decline. And many keystone species, if you've heard that term before, are fewer in number, but many of them are now close to extinction. So, before we discuss horseshoe crabs per se, I wanted to talk about a little bit more about other species in the estuaries. And right before COVID hit, a paper came out in Science on the loss of 3 billion estimated North American birds since 1970. And this was a short paper, but illustrative of the point I'm making is our impact on habitats. And basically they had a model, and they just predicted if all things stayed equal since 1970, and they had numbers of species and abundance of each species then, what would they be today if all things stayed equal? But they don't, right? So all of the losses occurred really from they didn't say why. So that in this paper, they just state they didn't find as many individuals of each species that they thought should be there. And another article came out in the New York Times a year before that about the insect apocalypse, right? So what is that? That's really the loss of biomass of insects. And I don't know if any of you guys, when you were younger, went on road trips. I certainly did. So my parents would drive from Maryland to Ohio to visit relatives, et cetera. And our windshield would be covered with insects that smashed on the windshield as we would drive. And I just recently went on a drive to see my daughter in Chicago. And we drove from New York to Chicago. And I think there was one insect splat on the window, so that's what we're talking about. This is biomass is been reduced. And these birds that most of these are in the passerine, the songbirds, come up from the equator, come up from the tropics to lay their eggs in our backyards, basically, and they have to feed their young insects. And that could be a reason that there are fewer surviving and a decline if they don't have their food, right? And just one last graph from that article in Science, we also see that the shorebirds are in decline, and the water birds that we often see, the long-legged water birds that feed in our marshes. Interestingly, the waterfowl, the geese and the ducks, have become quite urbanized. They love the urban setting with the grass and all the parks, and this group has shown an increase since 1970. And so if you look at our estuaries and how important they are, they have a dominant species, which most of you know is a salt marsh grass, Spartina. And this supplies structure and food and protection and all sorts of different aspects of this habitat that allows for this biodiversity you see in this picture. And so all of these birds that rely on that habitat for feeding, that maybe they don't breed there, but they certainly would feed there. And of course, down on the bottom is our friend, right, the horseshoe crab. And what is its role in this habitat? So in the past, it was called the cockroach of the sea. There were so many of them that they would be just harvested out of the ocean, that, just swiped off the beaches when they come up and ground up for fertilizer. So millions of them were just taken out because they seemed so super abundant. And so I wanted to step back and just give a quick sort of ecology lesson on the difference between keystone species and dominant species. So a keystone species is often defined that having an impact, great impact on the food web it belongs to. So the best example is the wolf. When they reintroduced the wolf back to Yellowstone National Park, they found just the increase in diversity and biomass that occurred, and the change in the way the rivers ran, and the trees that came back, et cetera, just because the wolves would chase the elk away. And so we found just a huge cascade of effects by this one species, but there's only 200 to 300 wolves now in the park, and they had that intense effect on the whole community. And so the dominant species are ones you're familiar with, the salt marsh grasses, the corals, trees, etc., kelp, and these are species that are important to ecosystem function by just their sheer abundance. So they need to be very abundant in order to have that impact on the habitats they're found in. And you guys know the story of the otter. Probably the sea otter was wiped out and due to the fur trade in the 1900s, and then it was brought back, and they realized its connection to the kelp forests, and how the kelp forests along the west coast of the US and through Alaska waters is so important for biodiversity and fish survival, etc. So I would argue that horseshoe crabs are a dominant species. They are supposed to be abundant, super abundant. And so let's think about that for a second. I went on the website in Delaware, the Natural Resources and Environmental Conservation of the state. On their state website, they're calling the horseshoe crab a keystone species, which means they have a big impact on the community they're in, but only usually in low numbers. That's what that would mean to me. But that, I would argue, is wrong, in that they are actually a dominant species. And when they're super abundant is when they have the biggest impact on the food webs that they are involved with in our estuaries and coastal regions. And so what is the evidence for this? So if we look at the connection between horseshoe crab spawning when they come up onto the beaches every spring, early summer, and lay their eggs, there need to be super abundant horseshoe crabs because they dig each other's eggs up, the eggs float, and the surf becomes awash with these blue-green eggs that you see. And that's when the shorebirds come in, literally by the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, up and down the beaches there, just engorging themselves on these eggs, as Deborah has really illustrated well in her book. And besides the shorebirds, all sorts of fish species come in and feed. There's the mummy chubs and silver sides, and the fry of many of the species we like to fish. The stripers, we found young bluefish all coming in to feed on the horseshoe crab eggs in the surf. And of course, many invertebrates also feed on them. Everybody loves to eat horseshoe crab eggs in these food webs. In fact, I did a study with a group at the Peabody with an entomologist there, and we started looking at the nests individually of these horseshoe crabs, and we found insects in the nests. There was a clown beetle, hysterid they're called, and there's carrion beetles, there were fly larvae. So all of these organisms living in and among the eggs and throughout the sand. We don't know exactly who's eating what and who's feeding on whom yet. We haven't teased that apart, but the attraction is this resource. And of course, horseshoe crabs eat, right? So they're going to eat the benthic organisms and invertebrates, mainly the polychaetes, etc. And so there's a big dynamic going on between this spawning event when there are abundance of species. Abundance of horseshoe crabs, sorry. So what happens in, say, Long Island Sound, where horseshoe crabs are fewer, and even in Massachusetts, that we don't have the numbers that they have in Delaware Bay on the Delaware and New Jersey shores. And so if you just take a look at the numbers of species and then the superabundance of those species that arrive on the shores, I got some of the data from eBird, which is a citizen science reporting group that birders add data to. And I also went down myself to check it out. And it's true, there was just an abundance of organisms. And even when you have this many horseshoe crabs come up, they often die on the beach, and you'll get a slew of scavengers. I saw bald eagles eating them. And of course, all of the insects that eat carrion, and of course the gulls, etc. So it is a real big resource that many other species, in addition to the birds, are dependent on. So if you look at the same scenario in the shores of Connecticut, usually they come up in pairs. They're very sparse. They never, that I've observed, dig each other's nests up. I've never seen eggs in the surf or on the surface. They remain buried. And therefore, we don't have the red knot feeding. We don't have these other species here in super numbers. There's a few come through and they feed in the benthic zone in the sand, but they're not getting horseshoe crab eggs. And I have seen the Canada goose sitting on top of spawning horseshoe crabs, wagging its webbed feet, and the eggs wash out and then they eat them. And I've seen that in 3 different beaches where they have a lot of geese near the shoreline because there's mowed lawns near there. And of course, if a storm comes in, we did a study where we put the eggs out and a storm came in and washed a couple of the nests away. We observed fish eating the eggs, and even Asian shore crabs would eat eggs and larvae. So in each of these cases, there's fewer species and fewer and low biomass based on just the numbers of horseshoe crabs. Okay, so when I started this work, I knew that we had to cover, over 110 miles of coastline if we really wanted to get a handle on what was going on in Long Island Sound. So I started to pull together volunteers, like many of you guys volunteer to do the counts, and I just want to encourage you to be involved. And it is very important that we bring our research and education and conservation all together and really work as a team. And that's really the goal of Project Limulus, is to find out how are these animals doing and up and down the coastline with the help of people who live right next to the ocean, basically. And about, what was it, probably, 2010 or so, we decided as a group of researchers up and down the coast to have common methods that we use to count spawning horseshoe crabs in order to have that data be comparable. So the numbers that you come up with in Massachusetts and some of these sites, you'll recognize that some of the counts that are going on by Audubon and other groups go out, and we all use the same methodology or close to it, so that we can come up with a number and compare it across beaches. So we do this in Connecticut, and they do this counting in Delaware and some of the southern states as well. And so what we get from that is we can calculate sex ratios, we can calculate numbers of spawning females per meter squared. Ultimately, we would compare that number to what's found in all the different states. And these numbers are important for management in order to know how to set the harvest limits. And are they increasing, decreasing, or are they staying the same? Are they stable? And so our spawning index from beaches in Connecticut is very, very low. So you come up with a lot of zeros, and it ends up being 0.008, maybe 0.01 females per meter squared. Whereas in Delaware Bay, it's between 1 and 2 females per meter squared. And that just tells you the huge difference. And that's why I argue there's a big difference in the effect of millions of horseshoe crabs coming up onto a shore versus a few maybe 1,000 coming up on a shore. So, so what happens then to an ecosystem when the dominant species is in decline? We end up with loss of species diversity. So we have fewer species coming to feed, loss of biomass. We might see 1 or 2 red knots. We would never see, 1,000 of them. Broken links in the food chain and food web can lead to collapse. These are cascades of effects that can occur. And so we call this a functional extinction. So horseshoe crabs no longer play an important role in the estuaries in Connecticut because there's just not enough of them. And so we have been pushing to try to close the harvest, to restore the marshes, and try to bring back the habitat and sort of clean up the sound, et cetera. So many programs, state programs, are based on extinction. So is this animal going extinct? What should we do? Let's hurry up and do something. Or is the animal not going extinct? Like horseshoe crabs are not going extinct. There are millions of them, but in many states, their numbers are so low, they no longer perform their function that they should in these food webs. And so this is just some of the results from these spawning surveys that we do up and down the East Coast. This is from Delaware Bay. They actually have quite a low ratio of females to males on those beaches. And if they really wanted to increase egg density, particularly for feeding all those other species I had in the past slide, you would need to increase the number of females coming up on shore. So they did try to set harvest limits by having a male only harvest. And it's debated every year, and people go to court over these things, and fishermen's livelihoods are at stake, et cetera, because they're used for bait for the eel and conch industry or whelk. And I guess you guys already know about their use, the use of the blood for pharmaceutical companies' need for vaccine use and production. And in Connecticut, our ratio is a little larger. It's 40% female that come up. But for a really healthy population, you generally look for 50-50 at least. You need more females to lay more eggs to get more adult horseshoe crabs eventually. The New York Times, actually in 2019, asked the question, the shorebirds were in decline. They sort of put a moratorium on the harvest for a while. The horseshoe crabs rebounded slightly. But are there going to be enough eggs, to help bring back the numbers of red knots? And there's other things going on with the red knot populations as well. As I mentioned at the very beginning, they need insects to feed their babies, up in the Arctic areas. And if the insects are fewer in abundance, there's not as enough food for them as well. So they have other areas that they suffer their population loss in. And then these stopover sites are really important up and down the East Coast for shorebirds that are migrating. So the results so all of the horseshoe crabs up and down within the US, any state that has a population has to abide by the Atlantic State Marine Fisheries Commission. And they put a report together every year. It's made up of representatives from the different states that want to harvest horseshoe crabs. And these reports are used to advise the states on how many horseshoe crabs they should harvest. And the Northeast, and particularly New York and Connecticut, which were part of the New York area region, is rated as poor. So they warned Connecticut and New York, and have been working with Massachusetts and some of the other New England states to try to come up with programs to increase the horseshoe crab populations. So I've been doing this sort of longer than the Atlantic Marine Fisheries Commission has been monitoring horseshoe crabs. I actually started my own tagging program back in 1998 or so. And I had made these cinch tags. This is my office phone number. I was throwing them out into the sound. And I'd have people actually call in and start giving me the numbers so I could track where they are. Then in around 2000 or so, the US Fish and Wildlife Service started producing a different kind of tag, these white disc tags you might see on horseshoe crabs. And I encourage you to call the number and report. Each tag has an individual unique number, and you can call it in. Sometimes they give you a certificate or a pin. And so we actually tag quite a few horseshoe crabs just to get an idea of where they go. When I first started this, it was not known if horseshoe crabs were like sea turtles. Do they come back to the same beach to lay eggs? Or do they lay eggs on one beach and then the next year go to a different beach? And do they go in and out of the sound? Do the Massachusetts crabs come to Connecticut and vice versa? So you could answer all those questions based on the tagging. And we found a sort of better way to tag by using an awl with a stopper on it that just puts the right size hole to put the pin through for these. So people don't have to take the instructions from Fish and Wildlife Services to take a power drill down to the beach. And that certainly isn't going to work. So we have hundreds of citizen scientists helping us every year usually. And this also had a lot to do with how much grant money I would get and students I could pay to help with our endeavors. And over the years, we've put out over 80,000 tags and have been able to follow their movement patterns, et cetera. And so we looked at, we did a real push through 2009 through 2014 to put out a lot of tags so we could get data back. And we did very well. We had over 14,000 recaptures, which is a huge database. On all the bird tagging they do, they get maybe a 1% return, if not less. We were up to 10 to 15% return on our tags in the largest numbers. And through the analysis, you can see, you can plot, where they were tagged and then where were they recaptured. And there was a big question if Connecticut had its own population of crabs and New York had their own population. And we put that to rest and we showed that these crabs cross the sound. And so this is one sort of big population. And I worked with a computer scientist and they were able to help me sort of make this app. And you can go on and put a tag number in that you found and it'll tell you where the crab was originally tagged. And so this is kind of a summary of just a whole bunch of traveling crabs and where they've been from 28 different sites in Connecticut where we've tagged. And so New York and Connecticut should be joining forces in the management of the species, not sort of being at odds with each other with different harvest regulations. In 2006, the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection set up 3 no harvest zones. So one was in Milford, one was in Sandy Point, one was in on a small island off the coast. And I'm not going to say that one, Menekatishuk, something like that. Anyway, so they also New York heard about this, so they set up a couple of beaches sort of directly across that had also designated no harvest zone. And so the states thought they were doing a good job. Now there's areas where horseshoe crabs can lay eggs and not be hand harvested. So a lot of the crabs in Connecticut, or all of them, are supposed to be hand harvested off the beach. And that was another problem I pointed out with their management plan, is that they're taking all the females that are laying eggs. And that's certainly not the best management practice. And so, but by setting these up, they were hoping enough eggs would survive to adulthood and replenish the population. And so this was a graph at a table that, not to worry about the numbers there too much, but I was talking about site fidelity earlier, that do horseshoe crabs come back to the same beach that they were tagged on? And approximately from, say, 70 to 90% of the crabs that we tagged were found again on the same beach 1 to 10 years later. But that means, 10 to 30% of the crabs go elsewhere. So they do. So, and they go sort of equally east and west. So they do travel around. However, the far majority, something like 96, 97% of them stay in the sound. So we had very few recaptures outside the sound. And in terms of using that spawning index that we calculate from your efforts when you go out to count spawning individuals, we've been plotting since 2008, how many there are, and sort of the bottom line here is that the trend is downward. And you would expect, if the 2006 no harvest zones were working, you would hope to find an increase, right? So it takes 10 years in development time, 10 to 12 years for females, to get an adult crab from an egg. And so by 2016 to 2000 today, I guess 2022, we should have seen an uptick in the numbers of adults if the no harvest zones were working. So again, we asked Connecticut Deep to close the harvest because the no harvest zones are not big enough, or there's other issues going on that we don't know about, that's not allowing them to increase. Okay, so what are the other factors, or why is the population in decline? Why are there so few? One of them is habitat loss. So seawalls, any kind of concrete barriers cause erosion of the beaches, and don't allow that connectivity between the land and the sea that the horseshoe crabs need. Pollution and certainly erosion of their beaches is a problem. The harvest, both Connecticut and New York claim that these are small numbers. 48,000, 366,000 in New York are harvested. I would argue that actually that does have an impact on the population. Poaching is an unknown, but people trawl all the time. They get horseshoe crabs in their nets all the time. Do they throw them back in is questionable. And of course there's predation, but predation on adults is pretty low. So once they get out of the first instar, they do pretty well in terms of survival, at least in predation avoidance. And a new problem was brought to my attention by some people working on from the Maritime Aquarium and a few other Save the Sound. They found that lobstermen abandoned their lobster traps, and yet they're still catching organisms, and nets that are abandoned and floating along the bottom of the sound are catching organisms. And a lot of what they found were horseshoe crabs in cases, because the horseshoe crabs are benthic in habit, and they tend to scoot along the bottom and can get trapped in these types of cages. Also, I did a study on power plants. Many of our power plants sit right on the water, and they have gallons and gallons of water they pull in to cool the machinery. And we all love our electricity, but the bycatch in power plants is quite large. There were 10,000 animals, 10,000 horseshoe crabs caught in an intake area of a power plant in New Haven Harbor. And so they were asked by the Connecticut Deep to go in and protect or somehow keep horseshoe crabs from going into their intake pipe. And so I'm not sure whatever happened. Their license was renewed. They're still making electricity and they're still pulling in millions of gallons of water. But I'm hoping they put some sort of barrier to prevent horseshoe crabs. So what can we do? So of course, we can ban the harvest of horseshoe crabs, or at least ban the harvest of females until they recover. This sort of happened with lobster as well, when they greatly declined in the sound due to really global warming, and just the water got too hot and they got diseases. They stopped the harvest of lobster. We need to stop the harvest of horseshoe crabs. And Joe Gresco is just a local community leader involved in the politics of the state, and he took it upon himself to stop the harvest on his town's beaches. Then he took the proposal just recently to the full House, and we just found out that they voted to pass the moratorium on horseshoe crab harvest. So it now needs to go through the state Senate, and we could find Connecticut completely shut down, I hope, in the next month. And that would put a lot of pressure on New York, and we're hoping they would also do that. So closely, we need to protect and restore coastal habitats. Working on a U.S. Fish and Wildlife grant with 2 other states right now, South Carolina and New Hampshire. And we have found horseshoe crabs are also spawning in marshes, in the marsh grasses, believe it or not. They'll dig a hole, lay their eggs, and the counts we have are equivalent to the counts we have on the beaches. So this is turning out to be an important habitat, not only for juvenile horseshoe crabs, but for the adults as well. And if anytime you can volunteer for any of these large databases, whether it's eBird or spawning horseshoe crabs or other studies, there's a study on monarch butterflies, et cetera, that you could be involved in, would be really wonderful. Like today, I took my class out, restoration class out to Great Meadows in Stratford and Bridgeport, and they're restoring a huge area of this federally protected marsh that had been really changed by deposition of sediment from harbors that we dredge, and they changed the water flow and completely killed off a large area of marsh. So we're out there now planting 170,000 plugs of marsh plants. So if you can get involved in any restoration projects, that's also a great way to add to the conservation of all these species. So our spawning counts are coming up. The horseshoe crabs will start coming up in mid-May through June, and usually peak around the end of May, the beginning of June. And so I encourage you to come out and help. And this is a site that I restored in Stratford, where we were using artificial reef to bring back another dominant but missing species, is the oyster. Oysters are supposed to make reefs and not just be in beds that we harvest for restaurants, but the reefs protect the marsh from erosion. And so we have hundreds of both blue mussel and oysters living on this bottoms of these reefs that are protecting this marsh. So with that, I just want to thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to take questions from the chat, or we'll unmute ourselves eventually and talk that way.
And Jennifer, could you stop sharing your screen so we can see people?
Absolutely.
Okay. I forgot to mention at the beginning that if you had a question, you could put it in the chat, but there aren't so many of us that we can't just go around. I do see one very lengthy um, something in the chat says, who needs some good news? Did someone hear? Scott Smith, would you like to share that good news?
Yeah, hi Sherry, and my apologies for being lengthy, but frankly I just copied it from our Facebook page. I work for Friends of Animals, and Dr. Mattei, thank you for appearing tonight, and thank you for all of your help. You have been cited extensively in the testimony of all the Connecticut legislators. And it's been an education process for them all. And we're gratified that they've gotten on board and agreed with Dr. Mattei. And it looks, you can never say that the bill is passed until it's signed by the governor, frankly. But it was overwhelmingly passed in the House side of the Connecticut legislature. And we believe the Senate will vote on it next week. It's the last week of their short session, and we're optimistic. There may be some shenanigans, but it's very crucial. And Dr. Mattei, heads up, I totally agree with you in your statement that we need New York to get on board for the Connecticut ban to be successful in restoring the population. So onward, and Massachusetts is right there as well. So sorry to go on so long, but thank you.
Yeah, I have colleagues working in New York that are also moving that, trying to move that needle, but it's been a tough sell.
Thank you for that comment, Scott. Jennifer, I had a question about the ban in Connecticut. Are there horseshoe crab biomedical firms in Connecticut that might have been against this legislation?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't think we have any companies that bleed the horseshoe crab. However, what happened in both New York and Connecticut is that when they banned horseshoe crab take in Delaware and New Jersey, the next state up is New York and Connecticut, and I think our horseshoe crabs go down in trucks to these companies. Now, the pharmaceutical companies are supposed to release them back into the waters after they take the blood, so it's not as lethal as using them for bait, where they chop them up, obviously. So this is a ban on the harvest of horseshoe crabs for bait. So we don't have a separate harvest for the pharmaceutical industry.
If I may be clear, though, the bill does have an exemption in case the biomedical harvest ever comes to Connecticut. So we were disappointed in that. There is no, as far as we know, any take of horseshoe crabs for that purpose in Connecticut.
For the biomedical purpose?
Yes, none.
Okay, excellent. I'm just going to go around. Oh, wait, there's some more questions. I didn't scroll down here. I see Luann. Would you like to just speak, Luann, and ask your question yourself?
Okay, yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I teach oceanography in Plymouth, and I grew up in Plymouth and have always been, seeing just in Duxbury and Plymouth, and now I'm on the Cape. And so my questions are a couple things. One is, with the Connecticut moratorium on harvesting, is that pushing fishermen to our waters to collect and even over harvest our horseshoe crabs now?
That remains to be seen. You're supposed to have a license and a state license in order to take horseshoe crabs, and so the legal take, and you're supposed to report. So the reporting is volunteer. So the fishermen count how many they take, and they report back to the state where they have their license with. So, you know, it shouldn't, but, you know, the illegal harvest, we don't have a handle on. There's not enough sort of monitors out there, people monitoring the take. Once it's banned in Connecticut, I'll be able to do that because I have groups of people that go out at night to count them, and that's where they encounter the harvesters.
Oh, okay.
So once it's banned, they would know that that's illegal, and they call the local police actually to come down.
Oh, okay.
But so Massachusetts has its own set of regulations. It's in the licensed fishermen to take them, and some of them are for the biomedical, as you guys heard about.
Right. Yeah.
And they're really important, and I wouldn't want that industry to fail. We all thank horseshoe crabs for our good health right now, because if you've gotten a COVID vaccine, they tested it with LAL, horseshoe crab blood, as well as every other vaccine you've had, from, you know, flu to chickenpox.
Yeah. My last question was, I had a long talk with one of the people at the local where they take the blood, harvest them for the blood in Falmouth. And my sense is there is an artificial, there's a, I think it's, you know, it's a synthetic LAL. And I know Lilly Pharmaceuticals has adopted it.
Yes.
Pfizer won't right now. But I just didn't know if scientists like you and other people are kind of that have clout are pushing some of these pharmaceutical companies a little bit more with since the technology is there for synthetic.
Well, this gets into the politics, and it's a federal regulation that you have to use LAL from horseshoe crabs to test vaccines right now. So that has to be changed. How you change that regulation is through data. So these companies, each of the pharmaceutical companies, needs to do huge studies using the synthetic variety, showing that it's similar, if not the same, not even better, some people say, than the natural product that's harvested. And with that data, which will cost millions of dollars to collect all that data and do all those studies, they could change the regulations. So that's where we sit, is that it's cheaper to collect the animal and bleed it than it is to run all those studies and get the federal government to change the regulation.
At the expense of the species. Yeah.
But as I said, horseshoe crabs are not going extinct.
Right. No, thank you.
Yeah.
Luann, did you want to ask the question about eels?
Yeah, I know. I've noticed that there's been a lot of, it's clear that the fishermen prefer the females for the, because of the eggs. They're convinced that the eels prefer the females as far as bait goes. And I also know that there was some synthetic bait that they were trying, right? I was just wondering where if there's an update on any good news on that.
I think it came out of the University of Delaware. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, right.
So they were using it in some instances, but it didn't prove as effective. I think, and then so it hadn't taken off. Although, you know, they do use, the fishermen know, you know, that they need to conserve the animal, and they use bait bags where they'll cut it up, the horseshoe crab, into 4 pieces and put a small piece in a bag and then reuse it each time they reset their traps. So they have reduced the number that they take. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to mess with people's livelihoods either. You know, the fishermen have a hard life, and they're just trying to make a living. In Connecticut, we only had, I think, 10 active licenses. So 10 people were harvesting horseshoe crabs, selling them to other people. But so it's not as huge an economic impact as it might be in some other states.
Right. Thank you.
I have a question for Luann. Luann, we're looking for pictures of horseshoe crabs on Plymouth beaches
Mhm,
back in the, from 20 or 30 years ago. So
mhm.
if you happen to have had any pictures,
Okay,
please send them our way.
I will.
Yeah, I was looking for some in Connecticut, and I have not been able to find any from, even the early 1900s, or
Hmm.
it would be really cool to see.
Yeah, film was expensive back then, and
I know.
people didn't take pictures like we do now.
Exactly.
Eleanor, would you like to introduce yourself and ask your question? You go ahead and unmute yourself, please.
Hi, I am Eleanor Jewett, and first, thank you for that wonderful talk.
You're welcome.
I grew up on a tidal river next to a marsh in Hingham, the Weir River, and I swam with horseshoe crabs, or rather, we kept out of each other's way. But I just remember seeing them, so I have just a fondness for them, for having been around them in my youth. And I also worked for FEMA and did a lot of mitigation work and other things for them. So I have just a very general, broad knowledge about this, but your talk was very informative. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You mentioned that they're not extinct or on that list. Are they by any means on another list, like the endangered species or some other list, categorization?
So there is a what's called the red list for the IUCN, and they are there. You can look them up, and the limulus, our horseshoe crab, is of concern. So we did a huge report from the Species Survival Commission that I'm on, and added all the data that we could manage, put together. And so they're listed as sort of special concern, but the species in Southeast Asia, there's 3 species. One of them we have listed as endangered. It's definitely endangered, and we're working on the other 2 because their populations are all quite small, much smaller than we have in Connecticut even. And so we're using an international listing to help protect them in that regard.
Thanks.
Thank you. Scott, I see you had another question. Would you like to appear?
Well, yes, thank you. It's a simple one. I've not been able to find any information about the harvest of horseshoe crabs in Rhode Island. So I was wondering if the professor or anybody else has information about that sector of the coastline.
Rhode Island does do some harvesting. At first they didn't, so I don't know what the current ones are. So that one was a state that was waffling back and forth. We have a group in Rhode Island that tags with us, and so they I think have been allowed to harvest if they managed it. I just don't know this year if they're doing that. And then we've also have a group tagging out at Block Island, which is interesting. They have a really wonderful area where horseshoe crabs are doing quite well. And we did find a horseshoe crab that left Block Island and went to Rhode Island on the main continent. So they do move a lot, surprisingly.
Yeah, thank
But
you.
yeah, but the Rhode Island doesn't have a big history of harvest, I would say.
Looks like Brett Hoffmeister wants to weigh in on this question, and then we'll go to Deborah Kramer. Brett?
Hello. Yeah, I just put in the chat just to answer the question. Rhode Island has a pretty modest bait fishery.
Brett, please introduce yourself. I
Oh.
want everybody to say what, who they are and what their interest is.
I'm sorry. Brett Hoffmeister. I'm with Associates at Cape Cod, the biomedical firm in Massachusetts. So I do a lot of procurement for the horseshoe crabs and whatnot. So Rhode Island does have a very small, a very modest fishery. I think it's somewhere around 5,000 to 8,000 annually.
Yeah,
For bait. And we take a small number out of there as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Deborah, you have a question.
Yeah, Jennifer, I was just wondering of the, you gave a number of 48,000.
I'm sorry, I want to introduce you, Deborah. Or you can introduce yourself.
I'm sorry. I'm Deborah Kramer. I'm the author of a book about shorebirds and horseshoe crabs called The Narrow Edge. Jennifer, I was just wondering of the 48,700 horseshoe crabs that you said were taken in Connecticut. I was wondering if you had an idea of what percentage of them are taken hand take from the beach versus coming in by trawlers.
Right, the regulations in Connecticut are all hand-based, so they have to go to the beach and take them. There weren't any allowances for trawling to take them.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. That's the end of the questions in the chat, but I am going to go around by who shows up on my screen, going from left to right, and ask you to introduce yourself and if you have any comments or questions. And please say what your interest in horseshoe crabs might be. So Carol Amato, you're on my screen next. You're muted, Carol.
You have me now?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Thank you so much for all your information. That's so very helpful, especially the comparison. So we can make comparisons here in Massachusetts. My question has to do with bleeding mortality numbers for LAL. Currently, it seems to be that disclosure is not available for either the public or the scientific community to judge, but it's estimated at about 30%. Since the ASMFC doesn't have jurisdiction over the activities of LAL producers, do you think states should or could provide oversight to ensure compliances with best practices?
Yeah, I suppose there should be some oversight, but since that study came out, which was actually done, I think, in Massachusetts on how the horseshoe crabs were handled, they were basically put in barrels, on a boat, and then the barrels were loaded onto trucks, and they would get too hot, and we would have a higher mortality rate. And since that time, they've been treated much better. The pharmaceutical companies want that species to survive because they, it's a natural resource worth millions of dollars. So they have been treating them into at least air-conditioned trucks and trying to release them sooner after they've been bled. So some of the studies, their own tag studies have brought that number down to 15% that don't make it. We don't have any information on whether bled females then take a hiatus from reproduction or not. We don't have effects on their physiology after that time. So that kind of impact we don't know. But there's certainly, like in all cases, they should have some monitoring going on when you're using live animals. The problem is that horseshoe crabs do not have a backbone, and all of the protection and federal government regulations on how to handle animals only applies to species with a backbone.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Glenn, would you like to introduce yourself and your affiliation? And
hi, Glenn Dentremont. I'm part of the Friends group of Miles Standish, but I'm also a very avid bird watcher and a birder. I used to walk, I still walk Plymouth Beach, but as a boy, I would walk Plymouth Beach in looking for birds, but I was also fascinated with the numbers of horseshoe crabs that we would see in early June, which are not there anymore. And I was very concerned about that. Plus the fact is hearing the information from Delaware Bay and all the red knots, specifically, I think it's the Rufo subspecies of knot that feeds pretty much exclusively there on their way north. That population has dropped precipitously as a lot of shorebirds. And some estimates 80% in the last 30, 40 years. So I was just fascinated, but I got a couple of questions and comments. First of all, it's interesting to see horseshoe crabs making its way around Montauk and coming on the other side. I know that they didn't crawl over Long Island, so it was rather interesting to see several of those actually on the other side, on the ocean side, which is,
Yeah.
that's kind of a long trip for them. That's kind of very interesting. Couple of questions. First of all, is there any studies being done at the possibility in terms of the medical group farming these, like you do shrimp and stuff?
Right, so that
Um,
has been attempted farming, but like I said, they take 10 to 12 years to reach adulthood. So that end,
like a tree farm.
they do very poorly in captivity.
Oh,
Even
okay.
the maritime aquarium and these aquariums that have, you know, special tanks, they last a year or two
Oh,
in
wow.
captivity, and then that's it. Some of them don't molt properly. Some of them just die for unknown reasons. And so they're attempting in the South to keep them in a pen that is part of the estuary. So almost, you know, keeping them in their natural habitat, but keeping them contained. So that, and then those animals can be bled, put back in their contained area, fed, if you will, or taken care of, and then maybe bled again. That might reduce the impact on the wild ones, so to speak. So that's being attempted as we speak.
Another question, if I may. Has there, it appeared based on the graph, the information there of the crowds between Connecticut and Long Island, they seem to be contained within a small geographic area. And if something happens to that geographic area, the population will suffer.
Mhm.
Is there any way, or has anyone looked at the possibility of taking viable eggs and moving them to another area and putting them there in an effort to maybe create new populations?
That's being done actually in Southeast Asia. A number of sort of hatcheries are going on in Hong Kong and a few other countries where they're trying to hatch a bunch and to get them into their first instar and then release them, trying to repopulate. I have a colleague on Long Island who is at Malloy College who has a lab, and he's been doing the same, but the state won't allow him to release them because they think they have some contamination of some sort.
Right.
So he's been fighting with them about that this is a common practice. It's that, you know, you can release it, but we also do need to pay attention to the genetics of the situation, to make sure they maintain that high genetic diversity, which they have right now. So that would be important if we started a hatch and release program.
I think that's it for my questions. Thank you so much. Very, very informative.
I think Brett wanted to jump in on this topic here. Brett, do you want to?
Oh, okay. No, just a comment. You know, there are some propagation efforts. I know Malloy College is doing ACC. We started a program in 2017, and 2021 we released our millionth second and third instar crab. So we've been quite successful with that, and
that's allowed in Massachusetts. Is that where you?
Yes, yes. So
Mhm.
we have a system set up in Malaysia right now. We donated one to a university there. I'm working with some people to try to get others elsewhere, and so there are efforts in that regard.
It's good to know.
Yeah, I was curious about that too, Brett. Getting permission to release the horseshoe crabs. What agency was that done through? Or
that was through the Division of Marine Fisheries. So we have a special permit, and we're allowed to release them in protected embayments that they identified by them that are known spawning areas. Stuff like that. There's a lot of concern because they are predators of shellfish. So they're concerned that if they're too successful, they're going to harm shellfish grants and things like that. So they do want to kind of be cautiously optimistic about its success.
Great, thank you. Thank you for your question too, Glenn.
Yep.
Lynn and Carlos, I know you can't have video, but would you like to introduce yourselves and ask questions?
Sure.
Hi, I'm Lynn Connor, and I am a teacher at Old Rochester Regional High School. I teach marine biology, and I always try to instill the importance of the horseshoe crab populations in my students. In fact, I have them going out on the full and new moons in the next month before school gets out to see if they can find any on the beaches as they come up at the high tide. So there is a question that, and I know it doesn't have to do with their ecology, but I was under the impression that horseshoe crabs will molt for a certain number of years and then stop molting. And my question, I can't remember what year or how old they are when they stop molting. Is that even a
Right.
thing? Is that true?
Yes, so that's true. They molt several times in a year when they're really little, and then they usually molt around once a year for 10 to 12 years.
Oh, okay.
And whenever you pick up a juvenile horseshoe crab, it has scissor-like appendages, and the final molt for a male, he gets the boxing gloves that you see, the claspers that they hang on to the female in the back, and then they do not molt anymore. So it's not like lobsters where they can just get bigger and bigger and bigger. They actually have a terminal molt, and as soon as they have that terminal molt, they come up on the beaches for spawning. All their energy goes into reproduction instead of growth.
Thank you.
Yes, and I'm Carlos Fragata. I used to be with SEMPA. So thank you, Shaw, for inviting me to this. Great presentation.
Glad to have you.
I've been involved with horseshoe crabs since I was a kid, except I didn't see anymore because I left Fairhaven, but I used to hang out. And I remember they used to give $1 per Telson. I never talked to anybody about it, but I knew it was going around and I was against it, of course. But the horseshoe crab, Limulus polyphemus, that's my first binomial nomenclature. That's my first scientific name I ever memorized.
Excellent.
Also, I was in Fairhaven, so PCB, polychlorinated biphenyl, was another chemical name that I knew. So I've been really immersed in this kind of stuff. So, but I have a question basically on the tags. So you make sure that those horseshoe crabs are old enough so they don't molt again. But how do you know?
Absolutely. Yeah, we don't tag the juveniles.
How do you know?
They would molt and the tag would come off, right?
How do you know when the female's old enough? I understand the male with a.
Well, we only tag the animals that come up on the beach. And no juveniles come up on the beach.
Gotcha.
Yeah, okay.
So all I do is, in terms of horseshoe crabs now, is I do mini presentations. I've even done it at Toastmasters for their little group. I have a 9-minute presentation. I've done it at the Herring Festival. I know Charlotte invited me to the Herring Festival in Plymouth. So it's nice just to get people to understand the animal and learn to love it as this crazy living fossil, and then maybe protect it someday when they have the power of the vote, or the power of being someone in a company that has the ability to sway which way they go, one way or the other.
Yeah, it's the most benign animal I've ever worked with. And I've worked with gray squirrels and all these other animals, and these things, they can't pinch you. They don't have enough muscle in the pinchers to pinch you. The Telson doesn't sting, it doesn't jab, it's to help them turn over if they get flipped upside down. And even my students this year, they said, oh, we thought it was used as a sword. I said, no, it's not a sword. So yeah, they're pretty harmless.
Right. That's great.
So thank you, guys. Nan, would you like to introduce yourself and speak? Okay. Oh, there she is.
Hello. This was a wonderful presentation. I love this topic. I love horseshoe crabs. I grew up on a beach with them, and like so many of other people, and I enjoyed hearing the comments from teachers of oceanography and other teachers who are dealing with this subject. And and letting kids know how important they are. So I'm very glad to be here. It was a great presentation,
Thanks.
Dr. Mattei. I
you.
really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nan. Next up is Bassett family. Please introduce yourselves, unmute yourself, and tell us what your interest in horseshoe crabs might be. I don't see reaction from the Bassett family. Oh, wait. What happened there? Maybe they went off. Susan Mann, you're muted. Please unmute.
I joined in late. Is there a recording available later?
Yes, there will be.
Okay. I'm sort of a retired teacher. I've done environmental education, and I live in Onset. Grew up in this area basically, and see the horseshoe crabs coming up on the beach to lay their eggs. And I was interested in, did you talk about, or do you know about any like citizen scientist projects that I could do?
Yeah, you just contact, you're in Massachusetts?
Yes.
Yes, so you can contact the state, what was it, DEC? Is that what they have? Department of Environment or Natural Resources. And they have a program that you could join. Audubon of Massachusetts does a program for counting. So in my own program in Connecticut, people can adopt a beach and they can go out and count. And you can look on the Project Limulus website, and we have all the instructions on how to do a count. So you could easily download that and use it on any beach in Massachusetts. So
Okay.
just have to get the data to the right people.
Susan, you're also welcome to join us in the count this spring. We're happy to train you and
yeah, you have to learn how to do it.
some field experience. So
Okay, thanks.
be sure and contact us if you would like to join our survey in Plymouth.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Kate, thank you for coming. Would you please introduce yourself? And first you have to unmute and then tell us who you are.
Is this okay now?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, I'm sorry that I was so late in joining you all. I own beachfront property in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and have been an advocate and for many years with for the protection of endangered species of migratory and nesting species of birds on Plymouth Beach. So for better or for worse, I'm sometimes known as the bird lady. And I occasionally see horseshoe crabs on the beach in front of my cottage. And so I've just always been, curious about them. I don't see many though. So it's just a pleasure to, listen to you and to learn more about these amazing creatures.
Thank you.
I have to say that Kate's beach cottage is pretty much directly across from where SEMPA does its survey, and Kate's been very kind to let us come down the road. It's a private road, and so there at the beginning we really depended on her to let us have a passway on Ryder Way.
Absolutely, you're always welcome.
Thank you, Kate. Susan Linder, would you like to introduce yourself? And
Sure, thank you so much. Just thank you to the host and Dr. Mattei for this wonderful discussion. My name's Susan Linder. I'm part of the Horseshoe Crab Recovery Coalition movement. And for those of you who don't know, we're a collection of conservation leaders, scientists, and organizations working together to restore horseshoe crab population back to the historic level. I've been working on the horseshoe crab survey tagging and that kind of thing in Delaware Bay for 8 years now. The past 2 years, I've been working on horseshoe crab egg density studies in Delaware Bay. And I also do rescue with Return the Favor. And I read scientific papers and horseshoe crab books, and it's just great to see and hear the authors. So I just want to thank you for this. So thanks.
Thank you for joining us. I have a question about Delaware Bay. Jennifer showed pictures from Delaware Bay, and they look like there's a whole lot of crabs every time I see pictures of Delaware Bay, but then Jennifer's data showed that the numbers of females are very low. So, I'm puzzled by that.
We do have a very good population. Of course, I didn't see it years ago in its heyday. I hear about it all the time. I guess in New Jersey, the population was more spread out than it is now. Right now it's mostly concentrated in Delaware Bay. Most of what I hear about, the big change is on the northern side in the Keyport area and Sandy Hook. There used to be a lot more there. That's markedly decreased. But we do have a very good population on especially like full and new moon nights. But yeah, not as many females. I mean, it's a big ratio. It's not close to 1-to-1.
Right, so if you have 1 million animals come up and 18% are female, that's a lot of females still, right? So the problem is as it declines, then the egg density goes way down.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Susan. James Green, you're the next one on my screen. Would you like to speak with Jennifer or introduce yourself? Not hearing from James, so we'll move on to Jada, and maybe James will join later. Jada, please unmute and say hello.
Hi, I'm Jada. I am a recent graduate student, and I don't really know a lot about horseshoe crabs, but I am just really interested in like the environment and conservation and stuff. So I just want to say thank you for this really great opportunity and like really informative presentation on horseshoe crabs, because I don't really know a lot, and it'd be kind of helpful because I'd be helping with the surveying in Plymouth. So that would be kind of good information to come into and not going blindsided. So I just want to say thank you for everything.
There's more on our website to read under the research tab, lots of papers that you could read more about some of our findings.
Yeah, that would be really helpful. Thank you though.
Jada, I'm so glad that you're going to be surveying horseshoe crabs with us. I did not know when we invited Jennifer that she was the person who started these surveys and is the one who has
the person who started them was in Delaware Bay. Yeah.
You were saying that you are responsible for making sure that all the surveys have the same technique and information. That's just so cool.
All right.
E. Taylor, you're up next. Please unmute if you're hearing me. Okay, I'm not hearing from E. Taylor, or not yet James Green either, or the Bassett family. Oh, here's Taylor. Thank you.
Sorry. My cell phone doesn't unmute very easily.
Okay.
I'm Elizabeth Taylor. I live in Brewster on Cape Cod, and I've been coming to the Cape for 74 years, and I've lived here full time for the last 30, and also volunteered at the Cape Cod Museum of Natural History for the last 30 years. And one of the things I do is I work weekends at our tide pool. And we have a number of horseshoe crab on display. Usually we have, I think, some 1-year-olds and 5-year-olds. And we also hatch horseshoe crabs because we're part of a Head Start program, which I don't know if it's through Woods Hole or Division of Marine Fisheries, but I had hoped that the Bassett name that I saw listed was Tyann Bassett, who is in charge of all of the animals and the aquaria at the museum, but she could give you more information about our program. But anyway, people always ask me tons of questions about the horseshoe crab, and I'm thrilled to have seen this forum. And now I have all sorts of information to hand out to people.
That's great.
And so I'm thrilled. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Elizabeth, just so you know, we've started Horseshoe Crab Advocate page for Massachusetts on Facebook. So every time I find an article or some information about horseshoe crabs, I throw it up there on the Facebook page, and you'd be welcome to do the same thing. But you know, certainly feel free to visit it or post on it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bill Vikstrom, hello.
Hello, I'm Bill Vikstrom, Friends of Miles State Forest. I've always had a great love of nature, and when Samba and Chow offered me the opportunity to count horseshoe crabs, I gratefully accepted that offer, and hopefully I'll do it again this year. I've always been interested in them. I do a lot of shoreline walking all over New England, and it's just interesting to see what you find on the beaches. And I've found quite a few places on the Cape where I've seen horseshoe crabs, even when I was younger, and I was always fascinated by them. So now to get to know more about them was just really interesting to me. I want to thank Jennifer for a great presentation, and I have a question for her. It's good to hear that Delaware Bay is still holding strong, but what about Chesapeake Bay? That might be the largest estuary and bay area along the East Coast. I think it is. And how are they doing there?
Yeah, I know they do harvest in the Chesapeake, but I don't know the numbers. According to the Atlantic Marine Fisheries Commission, they seem to have a good program and sustainable harvest, according to their numbers. But I don't know. Yeah, I don't know the numbers. The Atlantic Marine Fisheries Commission do publish their reports, and so you can find it on the web if you Google it.
Okay, my follow-up question is, what other areas in this country do you find horseshoe crabs? Is it just the Atlantic coast or the Gulf or?
Right, so they're found
Coast
from
too?
southern Maine. There's a small population still in Maine, all the way down to Florida and around the Florida Panhandle into a little bit into the Gulf of Mexico. It sort of stops at the Mississippi Delta, the populations, although there's some stray reports of some in Texas, but I don't know. And then there's a small population in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico.
Yes. Thank you, Bill. Do you have any more questions, Bill?
I think that's it for now. But
Good. I hope to see you on some of those 2 a.m. horseshoe crab surveys. Those are not my favorite. And last on the list, I believe, is Emily Brush.
Yes, hi. So my name is Emily Brush. I am a member of the Friends of Mashpee and a current member of AmeriCorps Cape Cod. So when this email was passed through about this presentation, I hopped right on it and was very interested. I grew up summering on the Cape, so it's funny that now I'm doing land management and conservation, trying to give back. But I've always had a fascination in horseshoe crabs, and growing up, I always used to see so many. And over the last couple of years, there's been a slow decline, and I was always curious if it was just because they moved or if it was a decline in their population. So Jennifer, I thank you for this presentation. It was very informative and just more knowledge about them. So now when I do see them every once in a while, I do have a little background information on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the one thing I would say is that our data showed some site fidelity. So if you have hand harvest and you take those animals, it'll take a while for that local population to rebound. So I think that's what a lot of people are seeing. If the beaches are cleaned of the crabs that are there, it may be several years before numbers start reoccurring there.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. Maybe you'd like to join us and see how these surveys go. I have a question for Brett. I don't know if you have the answers or even feel comfortable answering this, but we've just learned recently that another company is coming onto the Cape that is going to be processing horseshoe crab blood. And we were wondering, is this company going to be adding to the take, or are you guys sharing the take? Do you have anything that you could tell us about that if you're still with us?
I'm not sure I understand.
Oops.
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah, so Charles River Labs has moved into Harwich. So they've opened up a small bleeding facility there. So they are competitors. We don't share resources with them by design, but what sort of impact that will have remains to be seen. I don't know at this point. I just found out about this myself last week, so time will tell. But while I'm on the line, I wanted to say this was really a very interesting presentation. I thank you, Jennifer, and thanks everybody here who shows interest in these animals that they do an incredible amount of good for us, and most people aren't even aware of. And it's always good. It's always good to see the concern. So excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Brett, for that information. We've all been pretty curious about it. Well, we're just 1 minute away from 8 o'clock, and I think everyone had a chance to speak, but is there anybody else who would just like to use that last minute for another comment or another